Good morning to everyone. I'm Elisa from Ferrara University. I'm an aquatic ecologist. I study in particular nitrogen cycle and nitrogen dynamics in human impacted watershed. And in the last year, I tried to investigate a particular aspect that is the relation between the macrophytes. Between macrophytes and microbial communities, and how this interaction may be used as a nature-based solution to mitigate water pollution, for example, from nitrate. And Marco mentioned before the ecosystem functioning, and Chris and Florian told us that one of the main pressure causing wetland degradation is pollution. I will try to present how a particular type of wetlands can provide a peculiar ecosystem functioning that is also an ecosystem services. This is the outline of my presentation. I will introduce the study case that is the canal network of the Po River lowland in northern Italy, but it is representative of several irrigated watersheds in Europe. The main hypothesis is that the presence of aquatic vegetation may contribute to buffer nitrogen pollution and control eutrophication by removing nitrogen via denitrification. These are microbial processes. Our aim was twofold. First, we try to investigate the biotic and abiotic drivers that regulate this process, this microbial process. And the second aim was to quantify at the watershed scales the potential capacity of the canal network to reduce nitrate loads. And we combine experimental data and GIS-based upscale models. I will show you some of the approaches, the experimental approaches we use from the micro scale to the macro scale. And finally, I will try to give you some perspective of application of this technique in order to use this interaction between macrophytes and bacteria as a nature-based solution. Our study area, the Po River Basin, occupy about 1/4 of the national territory in Italy, and it is also a strategic area for the national economy because it accounts for about 40% of the national gross domestic product. And it is a very intensely agricultural exploited area, a very densely populated area, and it is, as a consequence, also an hotspot of eutrophication and nitrate pollution, that they are long-standing problems that are now overlap with new challenges, new problems that are, for example, the climate change. The effect of climate change are already evident in the Po River. For example, the increase in air and water temperature, the increase in the frequency of drought period or heavy rain, and the effect of climate change on hydrological cycle is probably more known, but is unknown how this climate change may affect also the biogeochemical dynamics, the generation, the transportation, and the transformation of nutrient loads in aquatic ecosystem. High nutrient pollution, high nitrate concentration are still a problem. And for example, in the Po River Basin, about more than half of the surface water bodies still deviate from the good ecological status according to the Water Framework Directive. From the maps, you can see that all the yellow, orange, and red lines are all water bodies that are not in good ecological status, and they are almost concentrated in the lowland portion of the basin, the central portion of our study area. If you look at the graph on the left, you can see the seasonal evolution of nitrate concentration at the Po River Basin closing section. And you can see that for the most part of year, the nitrate concentration are in moderate, poor, or not bad, but moderate or poor condition. And this is a consequence of intensely agricultural practice, but it is also a consequence of the removal of natural buffer in agricultural ecosystem that can be used as filters to remove, to buffer nitrogen, but also phosphorus excess. There are a growing body of literature that has demonstrated that also agricultural watershed, even if they are very simplified landscape, can maintain a buffer capacity against nitrate pollution. There are several examples also for Spanish sub-basin, for example, in the Ebro River. And it's very curious because there are an inverse relationship between the export, the nutrient exported from the river, and the density of the canals, of the small ecosystem. And also the recirculation ratio of irrigated water is inversely related to the availability of nutrients in water. And this is a first evidence that there is a link between the capacity of the basin to remove, as a sink for nitrogen, and the management of water, especially during the irrigation period. For example, in the Po River Basin, you can see that main canals and ditches, the extent of this ecosystem can be up to 2 orders of magnitude higher than large ecosystems such as rivers and streams. But at present, this small ecosystem is usually managed with the only purpose of water transport capacity to reduce hydrological risk and to provide irrigation, provide water irrigation. And from this point of view, a peculiar study area is the Po di Volano Basin. That is the deltaic portion of the Po River, is a completely flat territory and for the most part below the sea level. And this basin, in this basin, the water movement are completely regulated and artificially controlled by the local land reclamation authorities, that is the Consorzio di Bonifica in Italian. Water is withdrawn from the main course of the Po River during the irrigation period, and is distributed across the landscape through a dense, a capillary network of canals and ditches. And the excess water is then collected by two main canals, two main collectors named high waters and low waters, in Italian acque alte and acque basse, that are two tributaries of the Po di Volano. That is now a canal, an artificial canal, but an old arm of the Po River Delta. And we have a lot of data about the hydrological budget in this ecosystem, in this basin, and we compile also a nitrogen budget in this ecosystem, in this watershed. And what we measure, what we find out was very surprising, because this basin exports to the Adriatic Sea, to the less nitrogen than the nitrogen that is imported in this basin. And this is an agricultural basin that has a nitrogen surplus. And this basin metabolize not only the nitrogen surplus, but also a part of the load that is imported from upstream ecosystem. And this is a further evidence of the connection between the irrigation practice and the capacity of this type of ecosystem to control, to mitigate pollution, nitrate pollution. Why agricultural canals might support high mitigation potential? For a lot of different features. For example, they are terrestrial aquatic coupling. They are extensive and capillary distribution across the landscape, and they are the first point of contact for diffuse and point nitrogen loads entering in the hydrological network. And it's a particularly important point, the occurrence of three primary controls directly affecting the magnitude of this microbial process that removes nitrate, the denitrification, the presence of an anoxic environment, the presence of the availability of nitrate and the availability of organic carbon. And then other feature, for example, the high opportunity for nitrogen microbial processing because the residence time is long and there is a huge ratio between the biological active surfaces and the water volume that carries nutrients. And finally, also the frequent recirculation of water through the landscape that maximize the interaction between the bioactive surfaces and the water volume, especially during the irrigation period, that is during the spring, summer, when the temperatures are higher, and this condition stimulates microbial processes. And this type of ecosystem, canals and ditches, have the same characteristic of wetlands, and they can be considered as linear wetlands. And our aim was first, identify what are the drivers that maximize nitrogen removal in this ecosystem, and then quantify the watershed potential capacity of these canals to reduce nitrogen load if we properly manage this ecosystem. In fact, canals at now remains largely unstudied compared to other ecosystems, aquatic ecosystems, and they are scarcely included in restoration programs. And it is important to note that open questions concern how the management practices of this type of ecosystem may affect the large-scale nitrogen capacity of basin, and this how in turn may affect broader scale nitrogen dynamics in these very simplified ecosystems. We adopted several experimental approaches at multiple spatial scales, from the mesocosm, the coarse scale in laboratory, to the rich scale and to the watershed scale, because we try to extend to upscale the result that we obtain in laboratory through the entire canal network. What we meant by rich scale, we actually incubated canal section of some 100 meters in order to evaluate how these canals can remove nitrate and what are the processes involved in this transformation, in this mitigation capacity. Because we adopted this approach because the whole system approaches integrate all the nitrogen dynamics and processes that occur in different compartments of these environments, for example, the benthic compartment, the water, and the multiple biofilms and interfaces that are characteristic of this ecosystem. Jumping to the results, we measure with a simple, first of all, with a simple input-output nitrogen budget in canal reach in more than 20 different canals and in more than 50 different sampling events along the irrigation period. And what we found out is that if vegetation is present, for example, halophytes such as Typha latifolia or Phragmites australis, the efficiency of the canals is greater. And there is the difference in the capacity is about 1 order of magnitude. But what are the processes that underline this nitrogen removal capacity? First of all, we try to quantify the effect, the direct effect of vegetation in uptaking and storing nitrogen. But we found out that the nitrogen that is stored in vegetation biomass is less than 5% of the total nitrate removed in a canal. And this is particularly important because it's not that harvesting vegetation during biomass peak is not a good strategy, because we remove a little nitrate amount, but we also removed the element, the actor that support the depurative capacity of this ecosystem. So the next step was to measure the process that we hypothesized that was responsible for the nitrogen removal capacity. We adopted a Lagrangian sampling trying to estimate the open channel denitrification. We follow a water parcel from moving upstream to downstream, and we measure how N2 change in this parcel, because N2 is the main end product of denitrification. And then we used a model-based approach that is solved for denitrification rate, because the system is open to the atmosphere, and so N2 can escape to the atmosphere if water column is saturated. And we take this approach from American rivers, and we try to adapt and validate this technique to low gradient canals in the Po River basin. These are the results. In a huge number of canals, we obtain a very good correlation between the nitrate that was removed and the N2 that was produced. And it is a very important result, because denitrification is one of the few processes that removes nitrate completely, converting it to N2. And you can see that if vegetation is present along the irrigation periods, more than 80% of the total nitrogen loads incoming into the canal network can be removed. And this is a very huge potential. It's a very important ecosystem functioning, translating into important ecosystem services, that is the water depuration. What are the processes responsible for this nitrogen removal capacity? Macrophytes can promote a number of hidden processes, both in the rhizosphere and in the biofilms. And here you can see some of the main mechanisms that can, through it, macrophytes may stimulate denitrification. For example, the submerged tissues provide attachment surfaces for biofilm development, but also the oxygen injection into the rhizosphere creates a mosaic of interfaces of oxic and anoxic niches, where can occur couple processes such as nitrification and denitrification, the oxidation of ammonium to nitrate, and then the reduction of nitrate to N2, but also the accumulation of organic matter from root exudates or from decaying plant litter can provide substrates for denitrifiers that are heterotrophic bacteria. At present, the canals do not fully express their capacity, because the canals are managed by the water consortium, local water authority, with multiple operations, for example, vegetation cutting, dredging, sectional shaping, and bank reinforcement. For example, the vegetation cutting is usually performed from 2 to 3 times a year. The first intervention is at the beginning of the irrigation period, then also a second operation during the middle summer, and a third cutting performed in the late summer, early autumn, before the period of the intense rainfall, in order to maintain low the hydraulic risk. Okay, we demonstrated the canal network can be hotspot of denitrification, but what happened? But what we can expect if we supposed to restore vegetation in different amount of canal network? We used different upscale model in order to predict the nitrogen removal capacity under different scenarios of vegetation restoration in canal implemented in the area irrigated by the Po River water. That is the picture on the right. The models, the scenarios differ from, for example, the level of nitrate in the canals, but also the extent of canal network where vegetation, aquatic vegetation, is maintained from 5% to 90%, and also the type of vegetation management. For example, the current management, where moving performing in the middle of the summer, to a conservative management, where moving is postponed by the end of the growing season. This is a summary of the result. The lowest scenario is the current scenarios, where vegetation is maintained only in rare isolated stretching of the canal network, and bank moving is performed during summer. You can see that the nitrification capacity in this case is very low. Is, for example, 2 orders of magnitude lower than the load, the nitrogen load that is exported by the Po River. Different is the 90% scenario, that is the scenario that can simulate the condition in the early 90s, where when vegetation, when the introduction occurred, the introduction of mechanical moving that make vegetation removal more efficient. And in this case, the capacity of the canals to remove nitrate was greater. And it is unfeasible to think to restore vegetation in all the canal network due to the design, the actual design and the management of this peculiar ecosystem. But if we look at the other number in the graph, you can see that, for example, if we think to restore vegetation in about 1/4 of the total network, we could reach a capacity of removed nitrate that is equivalent to the load that is produced by a population of about 5 million equivalent inhabitants. That is more or less 1/3 of the total population living in the Po River. So it's a very great capacity. In other words, if we try to maintain vegetation in about 1/4 of the canal network length, we would be, for example, unable to meeting the load reduction target required to achieve the good ecological status under the Water Framework Directive in the water exported from this basin. And the greater capacity of mitigate nitrates occur in the months, in the period that are more sensitive, more where the eutrophication risk is higher, and it is particularly important in order to prevent eutrophication-related phenomena. And it's infeasible to think to restore vegetation in all the canal network. So it's necessary to properly select the canals where vegetation is implemented. So we need to investigate the drivers of the nitrification, and in other words, we need to parameterize the nitrate removal capacity in order to select where to maintain vegetation and when it's more efficient, this operation. So we moved to the laboratory in order to perform several experiments that investigate the effect of different drivers on the nitrification, for example, the nitrate concentration, the water velocity, but also the presence of biofilms and also the type of plants. In these canals, the plants are 2 or 3 different, for example, Phragmites australis and Tifa latifolia, the biodiversity is very low. But these plants can be very important. For example, the nitrate concentration, we measure that denitrification responds almost linearly to increase nitrate concentration, but then was saturated at higher concentration. So if we need to select canals, we need to consider, for example, canals with a concentration up to 5 milligrams per liter. Again, it's very important, for example, to select also canals not stagnant, but with a flow even if low, with a flow velocity. Because the nitrification is usually, such as other processes, is usually limited by diffusion, and diffusion is a very slow process. So if there is a small velocity in the canals, there is also a constant supply of nitrates to the bioactive surfaces. And the nitrification is stimulated by this advective transport. Again, the presence of biofilm, of vegetation provides more and more surfaces for biofilm attachment. For example, 1 square meter of canals with a dense stand of vegetation, for example, fragmented reed or cattail, can provide an additional surface area of up to 10 square meters to host bacterial consortium. And this results in denitrification rates up to one order of magnitude higher than in sediment, in bare sediment. And denitrification capacity can be also maintained outside the growing period because it's supported by bacteria that works even if less, also as lower temperature. And the effect of different plants can be ascribed to the capacity of different plants to provide surfaces for biofilms. For example, we found out greater rates in Phragmites australis with respect to T. latifolia, but if we normalize the rates by the surface available for biofilms, we obtain rates more or less the same in the two types of mesocosm. So the plants is important, but it's more important the surface that the plants can offer to bacteria. So what are the take-home message? The canal network can be, even if it's an artificial feature of very agricultural exploited ecosystem, can be also a metabolic regulator. And the element that support this ecosystem service is macrophyte, is aquatic vegetation. And the vegetation modulates ecosystem level nitrogen removal through its tight coupling with bacteria. So agricultural landscape can be viewed as a mixture of nitrogen sources, but also of nitrogen sink, if canal network are properly managed. And the restoration and conservation management of aquatic vegetation can be viewed as an active tool to try to mitigate, even if partially, the widespread nitrate contamination. And in this context, the canals and ditches can be considered as the new wetlands in agricultural watershed. And what is the next step? The next step, the challenge is to try to move towards a multi-purpose management of the canal network, aim at both guarantee the hydraulic efficiency, but also try to maximize the ecosystem service these ecosystem types can provide. Not only water depuration, but depuration is important, especially in agricultural watershed. So the message can be looking back to move forward, and the restoration of aquatic vegetation can be as a way to try to meet the Water Framework Directive goals. And it's important in this context to select canals that are more prone to maximize the natural removal performance. For example, it's important to identify canal reach where section can be enlarged because according to the increased hydraulic impedance due to the presence of vegetation along the all growing season. But it's important, as I told you before, to identify canal reach where the process of the nitrification of nitrogen removal is maximized. The future direction is to optimize this nature-based solution in order to improve water treatment performance. For example, through the increase the complexity of upscale models, for example, introducing new regulating factor, for example, the salinity that is affecting some of the canals in the Po River Delta, but also taking into account other nitrogen removal processes, for example, not only the nitrification, but other coupled processes, for example, nitrification and denitrification, but also anamox, also dissimulative nitrate reduction to ammonium. And again, it's important also to translate this function into an ecosystem service, so translate into monetary term. And last but not least, also to try to measure the greenhouse gases emission, because it's important to assess both the ecosystem service, the water depuration, but also to consider this service that is, for example, the N2O production, that is also product of denitrification in some particular cases. This is some of the literature that we produced in the last more or less 20 years, where we propose the restoration of vegetation, the aquatic vegetation in canals as a nature-based solution to try to mitigate lowland pollution in the lowland basin. And I would like to briefly thank all the founding bodies that supported our research in the last 10 years. For example, first of all, the Ferrara Land Reclamation Consortium, but also the Po River Basin Authority, and also the Emilia-Romagna region. And I would like also to thank you, all my colleagues who've contributed to to obtain these results, and also Marco for introducing me to the magical words of biogeochemistry, of nitrogen biochemical, when I was a young student about 20 years ago. And thank you for the attention.
Thank you, Elisa, for such a nice presentation. As you said, thank you for just a glimpse on 20 years of production of science. I think it's very difficult to study nitrogen.
Yes,
I guess.
It's probably the most difficult cycle.
Yeah, so I just wanted to shout out for all the work that you've been putting into this. Also, we had the opportunity in our last consortium meeting to visit the Po River Basin, hosted by Marco as well. And it was really nice to know what is happening not only in the Po River Basin, but also what can happen because of upstream incorporation of nitrogen due to agriculture and so on. So I think it is necessary to allocate the resources to keep funding this type of research, and I think it's going to give us some more clues on how to deal with that. I don't know if anybody has questions. You have a question, Marco? You have a question? Let's go first with Chris. Thank you very much. Sorry for this.
Thank you for the nice presentation, Elisa. You mentioned it just at your last slide that you were looking also to greenhouse gases in the future. I know from studies in the Netherlands that these kind of canals with vegetation, water vegetation, they are real big sources for nitrous oxide. Also from the sediments and the methane production. So for the climate, this is your advice is not good, so to say. So wouldn't it be better to try to convince that agriculture practices decrease the use of fertilization on the land as a solution? Because we try
to use to convince agriculture to reduce the fertilizer, but also the Water Management Consortium, the Water Management Authority, to move to a more gentle management of the canals, because they can provide a lot of ecosystem service if correctly managed, not in the actual condition.
Thank you, Chris. Marco, you have a question?
It's in between always question and comment. It was nice to listen to the first presentation because there were two groups of different presentation. One which was introducing these general opportunities, and the other two that are coming from scientists that are really working in the field with different passion. Alessandro, he's a passionate for mountains, very natural ecosystems. Elisa, she's working in one of the most I don't know.
I'm a lowland.
Lowland scientist in the middle of the Po River Plain. There is a lot of work for the restoration of this area. And it was nice to have this fully mentioned. And of course, there is nothing perfect. You were showing this budget in which you have costs and benefits. And from their words, Alessandro was speaking on CO2, but he could have spoken also about methane. When you saturate the soil, then you have this drawback, and you have to analyze cost benefits. Elisa was showing the opportunity of denitrification, and she could have spoken also about N2O, which is so it's a problem of optimization and decide what is the best option, not to minimize the problems and maximize the solution. also depending on what is most urgent, not a hierarchy on what is in this area. Nitrate pollution is really a huge problem, and it's mandatory to solve. And I agree with you that it should be better to start reducing the inputs of fertilizer because there is a large excess. And another two very quick point. Alessandro was mentioning that if you want to monitor vegetation in this REWET project, this is maybe a subject for the ground table, we have to monitor biodiversity and vegetation. But it's frustrating somehow that in a 4 years project, you have to study something in which you already know from experts that the restructuring of communities of valuable plant can take 20 years, okay? And this is interesting because also in Italy, we retire when we are 70 now, likely with Giorgia Meloni in 2-3 years, we will retire when we will be 75. It would be nice to have a European project lasting 20 years, fully financed, because you can be also relaxed as a scientist to study a lot, to have more satisfaction in following the evolution of the vegetation of fish communities and whatever. And so, but it's a message because it's also not sustainable to put a lot of millions in some project that ends and then nobody monitor the seed of the transformation, and so we need to give continuity to the monitoring action. This is also something to consider for this big idea of restoration. And the very last is about biodiversity, which come out from both presentations. We are always focused on charismatic organisms. The panda, I don't like panda. To me, it's too much. But bacteria, okay, the biodiversity of bacteria is never mentioned, okay? But most of the functioning of this ecosystem, most of the process we are studying, greenhouse gas emission is mostly driven by bacteria. So maybe something to consider is also the diversity of bacteria and the role of the restoration of the good diversity of bacteria, we are still very far from that. Yeah. Sorry, I was speaking a lot.
No, it's okay, it's okay. Yes, Anna?
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. Would like to know, what do they do when they cut the vegetation? They leave it in the ground or they collect it? Is there any sort of...
They live on the ground.
Okay, so there's no circular economy?
Not
No.
present. No.
And from your study, from your fast study, you would recommend that the vegetation is cut by the end of the growing season, so that is removed, or you would, if ideally you should leave it?
It's better to remove.
To remove because of course you are
in order
retrieving
to prevent the leaching of nutrients.
during the high season. Yes. So I think when we were there, there's also this discussion on business models, and now you could. So maybe the circular economy,
The biomass
but
could be used,
about this could be maybe something interesting to learn with the Chinese, because they have they use this for several traditional techniques, but also they have an extensive mowing system and so on, or the political tour so option. Have you made any simulations about areas that you could what areas should you, apart from if you just changed, you would improve the water frame and achieve the targets of the Water Framework Directive?
No, at present there are only pilot studies and not a broad-scale application of this technique. So it's not there are no results about the improvement in water quality. It's for now only simulation.
Yeah, maybe this would be something also good for the Ecology.
Thank you, Anna, for your question. Thank you, Elisa, for your question. Elisa.